I'm Amy Harrington. It's September 24th, 2015, and I'm conducting an interview with Nina Tassler on behalf of the Archive of American Television in Studio City, California. So we're going to start with about 10 minutes of background information.
Sure.
What was your name at birth?
Nina Cecile, C-E-C-I-L-E, Tassler, named for at that time, I think it was my great-grandmother.
And where and when were you born?
I was born June 19th, 1957, in Jewish Memorial Hospital in Washington Heights. I think it was in Washington Heights. My mom worked at the hospital at the time, and she had been doing a couple of different jobs. She was a translator for the Colombian consulate for a while. Then she was working at Jewish Memorial Hospital because her family's from Puerto Rico. So she could work as a translator. So I was born in Jewish Memorial Hospital in Washington Heights.
And that's in New York, right?
That's in New York City, yeah.
And what was your mother's name?
My mother's name, originally I found out, was Carol Norma Grau, but she didn't like the name Carol, so she flipped it and called herself Norma Carol Grau, and that was her maiden name.
And what was your father's name, and what did he do for a living?
My father's name was, because he passed away about 30 years ago, a while ago, Robert David Tassler. And at the time that I was born, he worked for CBS in New York. So he was an audiovisual technician at CBS, I think in Liederkrantz Hall, which is one of the old studios that the network had then. And my parents knew each other from the time they were 13 years old. They met in upstate New York, ironically, because my mother lived in Riverdale and my father lived on the Upper West Side. But they met at a camp in upstate New York that had been in my family for a number of generations. And my mother was working there. My father was working there. They met. And my grandfather on mother's side happened to owned a little house about 2 miles away from where my father's family's camp was.
And is that where did you grow up in New York City or at the camp?
Well, interesting. I started in New York City, in Washington Heights, and then when we were about, I want to say I was young, somewhere between 3 months to a year, my parents moved out to Long Island, which was Mecca in those days. I mean, that was, if you lived in New York, you had a dream of moving out to the country, and at that point, the country was Long Island. But we moved way out to a little town called Comac, which was pretty rural at the time. It was mostly dairy farming and strawberry fields, and so that's where we lived till 63, 64, and then we moved upstate.
Now, what traits do you think you inherited from your parents?
I am a very good listener. I'm an idealist. I have a great sense of humor, I think. Humor was a big part of the environment I grew up in. I appreciate humor. I was raised with Mel Brooks in the house, Woody Allen, Alan Sherman, Jackie Mason. These were people that whose voices I listened to a lot as a kid. I mean, it was just in the house. I didn't seek them out. But so I like art, music. I like and a sense of optimism. I am a very optimistic person.
Were those your interests growing up, the arts?
I gravitated towards theater very early. I think from the time I was 8 or 9, and I was already living upstate New York at the time, and there was no real theater program at the time. So I decided I would literally put on plays. I would write plays. I would cast my friends. I would direct the plays. I mean, it's a pretty. I think many people who find themselves in the arts later in life that pretty much frames their earlier years. And my friends were very willing to participate, and so it started early. I mean, my love of theater and performing and storytelling and storytelling was a big part of coming from a Latin Jewish background. A tradition of storytelling is very much a part of both cultures.
So what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to be an actress. I was actually. It was hard though because I was good in math, and I was interested in history, but I did want to be an actress, singer, mostly an actress.
Did you watch a lot of TV?
We did watch a lot of TV, so much so. My father built our television set. My father, years ago in the, I want to say late 60s, mid 60s, there was a company called Heathkit. And you could pretty much build any appliance in your home through Heathkit. You could send away, and you would get all of the tools and all of the equipment. So my father built our color TV set, and we watched primarily CBS. That was because he'd worked for CBS at the time, and so that was the network in our home. But what he did when he built the TV, he left the back off it so we could turn on. And I don't know if that was deliberate or by accident, but there was no back on the TV. But in those days, when you turned on the TV set, the diodes would heat up, so you could watch the diodes, the light sort of like track up the inside of the tube, and it was fascinating. So watched a lot of television, and we were, because TV was very much a part of my family's culture, there were TVs everywhere. There were TVs in the bedroom, there were TVs in the living room, and a lot of my friends were not TV-centric families, but we certainly were.
What shows were your favorite shows?
Well, I loved Ed Sullivan, watched Ed Sullivan. I loved Wild Wild West, just loved Wild Wild West. I watched Julia. You remember Diane Carroll's show? I loved Mission Impossible, loved Mission Impossible. I'm trying to think. Oh, my God. The Banana Splits, remember? I mean, I loved Saturday morning cartoons, but I also loved I was big on the dramas. I mean, that was The Bold Ones was one of my favorites as well. When I got older, I loved Quincy. But growing up as a kid, I just remember, The Wonderful World of Disney. But I loved the dramas.
So where did you go to college, and what was your major?
After high school, I knew, and I went to high school in Miami, I knew I wanted to go back up north for college. So I went to Boston University, which was the greatest experience, and I majored in theater. At that time, BU belonged to what was called the League of Professional Training Programs, because I knew I wanted to major in theater. I knew I wanted to be an actress, and I had to audition to get into the program. So I auditioned for Carnegie Mellon, Boston University, SUNY Purchase, and just applied to Skidmore up in Syracuse. And I went to BU, and it was a 4-year training program, kind of like a conservatory, where it was acting, dance, movement. But I did want a college degree, which is being in Boston. I was able to have electives that were outside of the College of Fine Arts, but they were 4 amazing years. I loved them, and still very active with the university now.
And what did you do after you graduated?
After I graduated, I stayed in Boston for a summer and worked at the Boston Arts Group as doing plays. And then I moved to New York. We had a little bit of a pit stop in New Jersey, living with because I met my husband at college. We went to school together. So we just stayed with his mom for a little bit to make some money, put some cash in the bank, and then moved to New York City in 1980.
And what did you do while you were there?
What didn't I do while I was there? I pretty much, and I know I put myself through school, but I worked through school, so I've always had to work to support myself. And so I I had done an internship at the Roundabout Theater Company when I was in college. So I went back and worked at the Roundabout. I swear it must have been about 90 hours a week. It was a lot. But I really got a chance to do everything, to work behind the scenes, building sets, helping tear down the sets, running spotlights, working in the box office, working on a fundraising campaign. I was also waiting on tables, like every good actress does in New York. So I was waiting on tables, working at the Roundabout. I was also helping friends do workshops. Plus, I was auditioning. I was, doing off Broadway plays. And so, like I said, just a number of things that would continue building my craft. So I took acting classes, dancing lessons, voice lessons, everything to keep your instrument tuned. But then also needed to earn a living, which is where the waitressing came in.
So why did you decide to ultimately move to Los Angeles?
Well, it really wasn't my choice. My husband and I met in college and dated for a while, and then we got married in 1984 in New York. And he, at that point, he was also an actor, and he was auditioning, and he had to come out to California to test for a pilot. Now, he did not get the pilot, but he did audition for a movie, and he got that movie. And that movie is a fan favorite, to say the least. He plays Styles in Teen Wolf. So he came out here, and I was not thinking of moving to California yet, but he was doing the film out here. He was shooting. I came out to visit him while I was here. And he said, look, there's great opportunity here. I think you are going to really love it here. And I came out for a visit. And I didn't know. I was, born in the city, lived in and around East Coast cities my whole life, from Boston to New York and even Miami. And LA was very different. I don't love driving. I still don't love driving. But he said, look, we're married, and I think this is great for us, so we should move. And that's what brought me out here.
And was your goal to pursue acting when you got here?
Yes, it actually was. I thought for a New York minute, when I still lived in the city, I had a small greeting card company. That was just kind of something that I did with a friend. I thought, well, when I get out here, I could continue doing that, but I thought it's a chance to get back into theater in Los Angeles. I had friends who had started a theater company out in Venice, so I immediately went to work with them, did a couple of plays with the Pacific Resident Theater Company, which is out in Venice. But that wasn't paying the bills. And I had two friends in California, one friend who had started the theater company, and the other was my roommate in college and is my best friend to this day, and that was Gina Davis. So Gina introduced me to her agent, and I thought, well, maybe I could do this. I said I needed a job. And her agent was kind enough to interview me, and we talked, and so I just started interviewing for jobs, and I ended up getting a job as a receptionist in a small talent agency.
What was the name of the agency?
The Irv Schechter Company, which was mostly television, a lot of people on soaps, directors and writers, and actually some animation writers, which to this day, when I watch credits on certain cartoons, I can see some of the clients that were represented by that agency.
So what did you think of your first behind-the-scenes look at an agency, and did you want to become an agent at that point?
I was very intrigued. I was also a receptionist, so I was an assistant to two agents and a receptionist. And I'm a volume-oriented person. I like doing I'm a multitasker, and I like doing a lot of things at one time. So the answering phones, talking to acting clients, dealing with packages coming in, filling submissions for breakdown services. I could do all of that, and something sparked my curiosity. And what I realized very early on, the training that I had as an actor, the questions that I would ask as an actress would be the same questions that other actors would be asking about auditions. So the talent agent I worked for, who was such a lovely man, a guy named David Windsor, who had opened the Brett Adams office out here and the Gage Group to, at that time, there were still medium-sized agencies that were thriving. Not so much anymore, but in those days there were. And he saw that when I was getting information on the phone, when I was talking to other actors, that I had a gift of supplying them with relevant information. When I'd be talking to other casting directors, when I was booking appointments, I was asking the right questions. So very early on, he said, I think you can do this. If you're interested, I think you can be an agent. But I've always had a very academic approach to things. So I thought, well, okay, where do I go to agent school? Where do you take the agent class? And he said, well, you're kind of taking it. This is it. You sit on the phone with me. You'll learn how to negotiate. And I said, okay, I think I can do this. And he franchised me as an agent. I was very grateful, and I started signing my own clients, many of whom are working to this day. And I also had an interest in representing playwrights. So I started building up a small group of playwrights and booked a few jobs and for clients, and got one play set up out here in L.A. A John Patrick Shanley play called Savage in Limbo. So we got that set up out here, and I realized I liked it.
So that was all at Irv Schechter?
That was just at Irv Schechter,
And that
correct.
you were there for a
7
year?
months. 7 months. Yes.
So you went from receptionist to
Talent agent in
setting
7
up
months.
plays
Yeah.
in 7 months. So then you moved on to Triad.
Yes.
Okay, so tell me about your experience there. How did you make that move?
Right. Well, I'm a big believer in, I don't want to say networking because I didn't know that that's what it was at the time. I just, I'm very interested in people. I'm very interested in talking and listening to people. And there was a casting director in New York who also was a director, a woman by the name of Risa Brayman. Now she's Risa Brayman Garcia. But Risa Brayman had directed my husband in a play in New York called Gray Spades. And Risa was very good friends with a talent agent at Triad Artists, and that woman was Susan Streitfeld. So Susan at Triad Artists was looking for she knew that Triad was looking for a new agent to work in the legitimate theater department. Okay, so I get a call, and this is all new to me. I have no idea what it means. I don't know about Triad. I literally know one agency and a few small theaters, and that's about it. And I did have, I knew a lot of casting directors because I had been assigned territories, but that was it. So Risa gives Susan Streitfeld my name. Susan Streitfeld calls calls Irv Schechter, and leaves a message. Susan Streitfeld from Triad. I'd never heard of Triad. I saw the message and I thought, oh, she must be from TriStar, which was a studio. So I called her back, and I said, I told her who I was, and she said, great, can you come in for a meeting? I said, I don't even know what this is about. She said, well, we're looking for a new agent. And I thought, oh, well, this will be great. So I went over. We had a great meeting. I loved her. Very artsy. We had a lot in common. And she knew Risa. And I thought, well, this looks interesting. And so I went through a series of interviews there, met with the partners. And one of the partners I met with was a guy by the name of an agent named John Kimball. And we hit it off right away. I met with John Kimball, Nicole David, Arnold Rifkin. That was my initial interview. And now I had met John Kimball in New York when I was an actress. And when I graduated from college, I had done an audition with all the other students that were graduating from these training programs at universities. And John's company was one of the companies that I went into to interview to be signed as an actress. So I remembered meeting John then. He did not remember me, but I remembered him. And I did not get that job at Triad, that initial go-around. And about a month later, I got a call from John Kimball personally to say, I want to offer you a job as my assistant initially, to learn about packaging. Television packaging was just starting up, and to just kind of come in and start working with me. And I really, really like John. We are very good friends to this day. And I thought this would be a great opportunity for me. And even though I was an agent, I said, look, can I bring a couple of clients with me? I'm very happy to come in and start learning, and then really to watch John and see how you work. And we hit it off, and I was extremely, extremely grateful for all the opportunity he gave me. He was a wonderful mentor, a wonderful boss. And it was funny, when I left Irv Schechter, I thought, you just go from agency to agency. I didn't know that you basically get locked out of your office. I mean, when agents go from one agency to another, you have to do it like, under the shroud of darkness, and no one can know what you're doing. I went in very innocently and said, I've got this other job. I'd like to give 2 weeks' notice. And my boss said, no, it doesn't work that way. So fortunately, I had taken my Rolodex out the night before. And I went and started at Triad and was there for 5 years.
So what clients did you bring with you, and who did you pick up once you got to Triad?
Well, I took Patricia Wettig with me at the time. I took Kurt Fuller with me at the time. A couple of smaller clients I signed. Scott Wenger, who ultimately went on to become the voice of Aladdin, and now is a writer. A young actress named Ala Karat. And it was a really fantastic opportunity. A lot of the clients that John had, I was more in the service, sort of as a servicing agent. So the people that he represented, I worked with as well. And in those days, it was Nell Carter, Victoria Principal, Meredith Baxter, Ken Kercheval, Bob Newhart. When I first started working with him, he represented Fred Gwynn. It was an amazing talent roster, and it was a really great opportunity. And I learned about television packaging. In those days, the agency represented Roseanne, and Roseanne, was a stand-up at the time. And one of the agents I worked with signed her, and was involved in packaging the show. So it was an unbelievable opportunity.
And just briefly, what is television packaging?
What television packaging is, the agency puts together all of the elements, and as opposed to an actor or actress paying the agency commission, the agency itself takes a commission off of the license fee from the show. And that was basically just starting out. And it was an opportunity for agencies to begin to make a lot of money. They were beginning to put together what they called taking their A-list talent with other A-list talent and putting it together and taking that to a studio, as opposed to the studio putting all of those elements together.
Right. So why did you decide to leave Triad? It sounds like you were enjoying it.
You know what? I really think and even now, I look back on agenting as, I think, truly one of the great kind of learning experiences of my career. And but you have, and I do love to sell. I mean, I love to sell. I love negotiating deals. I love representing actors, and I represented writers at the time. And towards the end of my time at Triad, one of my primary territories was Lorimar Television. So I represented a lot of people and made a lot of deals for writers. Remember Paul Kreppel, Meredith Baxter. The movie of the week business was very big, and Lorimar was doing a lot of movies of the week. So I knew a lot of the people at Lorimar. I knew the casting directors. I knew the business affairs people, and I thought, I like that studio. I like the people that work there. And all of a sudden I was up for a promotion at Triad. And I thought, you know what? I don't know if I want to do this. I was beginning to hear something about development and what development was, and I was very intrigued by that. And as much as I loved agenting, and I did, I really enjoyed it and I have great respect for agents, I thought this development thing sounds pretty interesting because part of the problem is when you're an agent and you've done your deal and your client is working, you're out of it. You're done. It's over. And I would get very involved in the scripts and packaging a piece of material with the actor. And then all of a sudden, again, once you set up that project, it's done. It's time to move on. And I had trouble I had trouble separating. And I'd heard about development, and I heard about this one job in particular at Lorimar Television. In movies and miniseries, that was what I was doing a lot of work in movies and miniseries, and I thought, let me just stick my toe in here. Let me see what this is really all about. And as fate would have it, there was a particular job opening up because the woman who was doing the job was leaving to go to work at CBS in movies and miniseries. So I heard about this job, and I thought, I think I'd like that. I think I'd like to do that. So that's what kind of prompted the move to Lorimar.
So how did you heard about the job, but how
Yes.
did you get the job?
I have never been one to stand idly by. It's not in my nature. And if I see something and I think I think it's an opportunity, I will go for it whole hog. I had heard that Leslie Moonves was the person who was going to be hiring. And I called my boss. At the time, I was still a triad. I called John Kimball and I said, will you help me get this job? I said, will you help me get this interview with Leslie? And Barbara Miller, may she rest in peace, who was truly one of the most gifted casting executives in the business. I knew Barbara, and I knew Barbara was very close to Leslie, so I called Barbara. I called John Kimball, and I said, just get me in there to meet him. I said, I know I'm right for it. I knew his background. I knew he came from the theater. I knew he was an actor. He'd worked in New York off-Broadway and Broadway at the time. And I said, we had a lot of similarities in our background. I said, I think I can nail this. So Barbara Miller called, my boss called, and then I strategically made some calls to other producers who had deals at Lorimar, some Meredith Baxter, I represented at the time. I asked her to make a call. So all of a sudden Leslie started getting these calls, and I got my interview. And I went in to interview with Les, who was either the executive vice president of creative affairs at the time. He had not been made president of Lorimar yet. But I went in and literally I can tell you to this day what I was wearing. I remember the layout of his office. Lorimar was still over at Culver Studios at the time. They hadn't moved over to the Valley yet, to Warner Brothers. And I just knew that this was something I could do. When I went in for that interview, I was sitting outside his office, and I said, "This is the most important audition of your life." And I went in, and in my mind, I thought to myself, I am not going to stop talking until I feel like I have this job. And I just started talking. And at one point I said, I could see that he had made a decision. I could see in his eyes that he made a decision. And maybe I was reading into this, but I really felt like I knew at that moment he had hired me. And so I began to back off. We went over all the things we had in common, all the people I represented, that I love to sell, that I come from the theater, all of these things. These were, points we had in common. And I just felt, oh my God, this is that moment. And afterwards, I wanted to really seal the deal. And I called every single person in Hollywood who knew Leslie Moonves and had them call him. And I think at one point he said, if another person calls me to tell me to hire you, I will not hire you. But it was, you have to, that's what you do. I was agenting for myself. And then I did get that job.
Amazing. What was your first impression of Leslie?
I felt I felt a real kinship with him. I felt he was incredibly smart, incredibly sharp. More than anything, I could understand we had a common language. I felt he was someone who had great respect for process, for the art. But I knew he was driven. I could tell he was driven. I could tell he had incredible confidence. He felt like a leader. He was very animated. He was really comfortable with himself, and I think so much of what I was looking for was I was looking for people or a person that didn't expect or want me to be somebody other than myself. And I think he was someone who was incredibly comfortable in his own skin. And I had such great respect for that, because that's one thing too. I've never. I mean, I think maybe being, being Puerto Rican and Jewish and a woman and coming from, an artistic background, I could only be myself. I couldn't be somebody else. And even though Leslie wore a suit, there was the heart of an artist there, and I think there was someone I could really, and I knew there was someone I could really relate to.
That's great. So what were your responsibilities as director of movies and miniseries?
Right. At that point, a lot of it was making writers' lists, reading new writers, meeting with people, new writers, hearing pitches, getting a sense of the competitive landscape, what was selling, what were certain networks wanting to buy. I did work for Cindy Dunn was the first executive I worked for, and then Lindy DeKoven came in after that. So they were extremely different executives. Cindy was a little bit more laid back. Lindy was a real go-getter and a terrific salesperson. And so I read a lot of books, which I've always been a big reader. So I was reading books, reading spec material. And then Lindy would go ahead and do the sales. I mean, periodically I would go out and pitch to the networks as well. But when I first started, it was doing a lot of the background, also reading a lot of articles. Were there good ideas that would be the basis for movies of the week? I was also meeting with former actor clients who wanted to be, who wanted to continue in the movie of the week business. So those were my primary responsibilities.
So in addition to marrying acting talent, were you marrying like directors and producers
Yes.
to the material as well?
Yes, because we had at that time, because the movie of the week business was thriving. So there were a lot of overall deals, many of whom deals that I made when I was at Triad, who now were at Lorimar. So I got to work with Joel Simon and Bill Todman, Andrea Baines, Judith Page Mitchell. There were a number of long-form producers who were there. So I would meet with them as well and find, just sort of kick around some ideas with them, basically do a lot of coordinating and scheduling, pitches at different networks. And it was such a vibrant, very financially very lucrative business for the studios in those days.
Now, in 1993, Lorimar merged with Warner Brothers.
Correct.
How did that impact your job?
Well, it's funny. The timing, I'm not remembering exactly. I was in movies and miniseries for not that long because it was interesting. They had just kind of peaked when I first got over to Lorimar, and then the drama series business began to take off. So I used to look out my office window and I'd see like the movie of the week producers sort of gradually leaving the lot, and the drama producers and the comedy producers. That roster began to really build at the studio. So what happened is, as the movie the week business began to taper off, there was an opportunity in the series, in drama series. And literally, I think the very first day I started work at Lorimar was the day that Leslie was promoted to president of Lorimar Television. And so I had been, again, working in movies and miniseries. Then the opportunity came up to go into drama series. And I wrote to Leslie. I wrote him a long letter. I went in to see him. I said, I really think I would be great at this. I think I can do, I said, I love the series world. I think I have got, I learned a lot in the movie business, but I feel like I could really do an even better job in drama series. And he thought about it, and he considered it. They had just hired a new executive in drama series, Tony Jonas, who, when Leslie got promoted, Tony got promoted underneath him. They brought in a vice president of drama series, a guy named Billy Campbell, and he was the one who I also reached out to and said, you should take me in the drama series department. I think I'd be great. And Leslie, who had always been such a great supporter of mine, I think whispered in Billy's ear and said, you should bring her in. So that was when I transferred from Movies of the Week into drama series and stayed in drama series the whole time I was at Lorimar, which basically was, even though we took the name Warner Brothers, all of the talent deals, producing deals, directing deals that we had kind of merged with Warner Brothers. But primarily all of the talent who were at Lorimar stayed at Warner Brothers as well.
So did your responsibilities, besides the fact that the content itself was different, how did your responsibilities change?
Pretty dramatically. I was very aggressive in finding, again, writers from the theater, finding writers from, again, all of the agencies, as well as coming up with ideas. And because there were just two of us in the department, Billy Campbell and myself, there was a lot more. It was a lot more volume, and the pace. You had a selling season. The Movie of the Week department was year round. You had a selling season in drama series, and the elements of the structural elements were different. So I, having had a theater background and knowing how to really break down structurally a play, understanding the arcs, understanding character development, that came in very handy in drama series. And Billy Campbell, who came from a business background, he'd worked at ABC briefly. We had very different skill sets. So I was, I took sort of the bull by the horns and was very aggressive in developing relationships with a lot of the network executives, bringing in a lot, new voices to Warner Brothers, and the greatest part is I was at Warner Brothers when one of the projects we developed was ER. So being there for that was an unbelievable experience, and a lot of because Leslie had a theater background as well, there were a lot of producers and directors and writers who worked at Warner Brothers who came from the theater. So I had that relationship as well.
I want to talk about ER in a minute, but before we do, you said there was a very specific selling season.
Yes.
So talk about what your kind of steps were in the process during that period of time.
Well, the networks would open for business, and at that time there was a tremendous. I mean, the volume was amazing. Almost, oh my gosh, I would say almost 3 times what it is now, because Fox had just launched as a network. Obviously, they were very aggressive at looking for new product. So the networks would open traditionally around July, and they would be open for business. And the selling season went somewhere from mid-July all the way until, I would say, late September, early October at that time. And you had to, you had to develop your pitches. And I was a real stickler for the process of pitching. I was, I now, when executives come in to pitch, they're not as sort of a part of the pitch. Maybe I just was a busy buzzy, and I felt very, I felt beholden to the writers, and not all writers are great pitchers. Those skill sets are somewhat, they're antithetical to each other. Being a writer and being able to pitch, sometimes, they're challenging. So I would do the preamble before the pitch, be there with the writer to sort of help out if there were things that we'd rehearsed a number of times before we went into pitch. So I had a process. I had, there are certain things that I would, I was a real stickler for, like we would never leave pages behind. You never, a good 10-minute pitch, a 15-minute pitch at the most, that was the most effective. And to help keep the writer kind of on track if there were times where they would veer off into a tangent. But I would sort of pre-clear an area with the network executive before, so the writer knew before he or she went in, any kind of inside information that would help them with the pitch. Then if we were going to a different network, we might have to augment the pitch, modify it in some way that was better suited for another network. I really felt that my job at that point was making and creating the best environment for the writer to pitch, and selling was in my blood. So I felt that it was my job to bring in the perfect pitch and to help that network, to make it impossible for the network to say no.
Did you ever kind of navigate a bidding war on any series that you remember?
Yeah, oh, definitely. There were, a number of projects and writers. I mean, one of the writers that I am fortunate enough to work with to this day, Barbara Hall, was a writer I worked with at Warner Brothers. John McNamara was a writer that I worked with at Warner Brothers. Several of their projects, they were well sought after, and several of their projects, we would. But it was interesting. There seemed to be a more of a contrast between the network's taste, what their brand was in those days. That's changed dramatically today. And so if something was, you would really craft a pitch that was perfectly suited for a particular network. So I want to say there was a kind of honor system, and if you promised something to, Greer Shepard was the executive at ABC that I would sell to, Kevin Riley was the executive I would sell to at NBC, Fox was Bob Greenblatt, and CBS was Jonathan Levin. So I worked very closely with them to really identify what they were looking for. Jonathan Levin at CBS at the time was and is to this day a big reader, so he liked to develop a lot of books. But really getting the lay of the land from that network executive really helped hone the pitch and craft the pitch with the writers before we went in.
And then once a show went into production, were you heavily involved in scheduling and the production elements and watching shows and giving network notes and all of that?
Well, it was interesting because I was at a studio. Once you sold your pilot and once you were in development, I was working very closely with the writer and with the network and making sure that what the network was requesting in terms of notes, changes, et cetera, that they were very specific, and I was able to liaison with the writer to make sure the notes were addressed to the network's satisfaction, to make sure that the elements that that network was looking for, i.e. in the form of a director or an actor, that I could begin packaging, if you will, that pilot to make it a hot property at the network. At that point, the networks kind of kept very much to themselves. I mean, they didn't share a lot of information in those days, so you really had to do reconnaissance and get as much information as you possibly could. In terms of scheduling, one of the things that, and this is where, again, I learned from my boss, once that pilot was shot, and getting as many pilots shot was really important. And once Leslie was, again, he was running the studio at the time, he was a top producer. So we were selling the most, we were getting the most pilots picked up, we had the most series on the air at the time. But in terms of scheduling, that was kind of the network's responsibility. But Leslie who was the consummate salesman and is to this day, we would make suggestions to the network. So if we had a pilot shot, part of getting that pilot picked up to series was saying and identifying that pilot as a great companion piece for an existing series that was already on the air at the respective network. So he was definitely distinguishing himself as someone who was as smart, if not smarter, than a lot of the people who are at the networks, and providing viable sales information to ultimately get that pilot picked up to series.
So let's talk about a specific show. Let's talk about ER
Yeah.
and talk a bit about the development of that show.
Developing ER was truly one of the greatest experiences of my life, for so many reasons. One, I got to work with John Wells, who to this day is also a very, very dear friend. I have tremendous respect for John. John had been a theater major at Carnegie Mellon, so again, we had that common language. But the sort of the path that script took on its journey to making television history was so extraordinary and interesting and special. It had been, ER was originally called EW, and it was a movie script that was sitting on the shelves at the CAA script library. And Tony Krantz, who was an agent at CAA in the day, found this script. It was written by Michael Crichton and based on his experiences doing his residency. An EW for emergency ward as opposed to what we turned into, which was ER. Not too many people knew what EW was, but you know what an ER is. And Tony Krantz gave the script at the time to Tony Thermopoulos, who was working at Amblin, also gave the script to John Wells, who was a client of CAA at the time, and packaged it. So John Wells and at that time Steven Spielberg with Tony Thermopoulos started working on the script. And the process was pretty challenging because it was condensing a 2-hour movie script that had, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere about 180 speaking parts. Because never before had we read a script that was really about, that had such specificity and was about a very specific place and was less about the cases that came in and more about the doctors and the lives of the doctors. So John was, gradually paring down the size, condensing roles, and I worked with him on that process. He was very generous and was a great partner, and so we were working on the script together. And one of the really exciting parts was Rod Holcomb, who John had worked with, came on board as the director. And at the time, George Clooney had been under contract to Warner Brothers. Leslie had kept him there for a number of years. He had done a number of pilots that did not get picked up. He'd been on Sisters. But I first met George when I was at Triad. So John Kimball represented him for a while. And so I met George initially at John's office before I actually even came to Lorimar and then Warner Brothers. And George was looking to do another pilot that year. As I said, Leslie kept him under contract for years and years. And he read the script, and he really loved it. And but there was another project that NBC had in development, something called Golden Gate, that was written by a writing team of Johnson and Pavone. And NBC wanted George to do Golden Gate desperately. And they said, we'll green light the pilot if George does it. And I'll never forget, there were some rumblings that, ER wasn't going to get picked up, it wasn't going to get shot, something was, things weren't going. And I don't know where that was coming from, because the pilot, we always figured the pilot would get picked up. We always knew that, it was a terrific script. I mean, John Wells was doing an amazing job. So it had all the earmarks of something that was going to definitely go to pilot. So I remember George came into my office at Warner Brothers. He's like, "What should I do? Should I?" And by no way am I saying I told George to do ER. George just loved that script, and he loved that character, and he said, "Is this going to fall apart?" And I said, "I really don't think so." I said, it's really on solid footing. I'm pretty sure it's going to get picked up." I said, "But I can't guarantee it. But I've heard nothing to the effect that this is going to fall apart." And George went in and fought for the role and was cast. And I remember watching the dailies to this day. I remember that cast like it was yesterday. And I remember sitting in Warren Littlefield's. I don't know if it was Laurie Openden. I think it was Laurie Openden's office at NBC when we brought in actors to read for Dr. Peter Benton. And I remember the actors, Isaiah Washington came in, Michael Beach came in to audition, and Leslie, and the network had approved one of the actors, but Leslie felt he had a better idea. And he did. There was an actor named Eric LaSalle who was finishing up a series that we had, a series at CBS called Under Suspicion. And Leslie said, "I think Eric is the guy for this part." And so, sure enough, the network approved it, but we had to push production a couple of days on ER so Eric could finish doing Under Suspicion and then could go over and do ER.
And Juliana Margulies' character was killed off in the original pilot script, right?
Well, what happened is the chemistry between Juliana and George was palpable. I mean, they were such a great couple on screen, and her character at the end of the pilot had taken an overdose of pills and was supposed to have committed suicide. So at the end of the pilot, you didn't know what her fate would be, but they were so great together that we decided at that point, you know what? She's going to survive that overdose and come back and stay with the series.
The show kind of took off when it moved to Thursday night, right?
I think we were always on Thursday night. I don't think we changed. It was what was the big, sort of the news story going into that fall was ER was going to go up against Chicago Hope. So Chicago Hope was obviously at CBS, was David Kelly's show, and that all during development, all during pilot production, Chicago Hope was projected to be the breakout hit. ER was a little bit of a sleeper. It really wasn't on anybody's radar. but they went head to head. So it was Chicago Hope, I believe, that moved. ER stayed on Thursday night. But was interesting that during the pilot testing process, NBC was very nervous. I think they weren't quite sure what the future of that show would be. And pilots are generally subjected to a pretty rigorous testing process. So the studios we did a test for ER that was, to this day, one of the best tests of any pilot I've ever seen. There's a graph and a curve. Well, what happened is the graph shot straight up to, I believe, the 90th percentile, and then stayed at the 90th percentile the entire time. So when the studio delivered the pilot to NBC, they couldn't believe the testing results. So they did a test, which normally they do, a network would. They didn't believe that test either. So they asked for another test. So I had to keep going to these tests because NBC couldn't believe how high the pilot was testing. But ultimately, when the two shows were scheduled opposite each other, everybody was betting on Chicago Hope, and then they moved Chicago Hope up. So I'm pretty sure ER stayed on Thursday night.
Okay, cool. So now you moved to CBS
Yes.
in 1997. Why
Yes.
did you decide to move over there?
Well, when Leslie hired me to go to Lorimar, and to Warner Brothers, I felt very connected to him. I'm very loyal, and I had learned that there was going to be a change at CBS, and that my boss, Leslie Moonves, was going over to run the network. I was devastated, and like I said, I felt a real strong connection to him, and I wanted to. I didn't quite know what life at Warner Brothers would be without him, and I stayed. I stayed at the studio a little while longer. I had a contract, so I had to uphold the contract. But I really felt that, again, this would be a great learning opportunity. I enjoyed being at the studio, enjoyed the selling process, but I was curious what life would be as a buyer. And so once Leslie went over, I sat and talked with him, and I said, I feel very connected to you. I feel very loyal to you. You hired me. You gave me these opportunities. If and when you're ever interested, I would love to come to the network. And, because of sort of kind of the legal parameters of him going from the studio to the network, I couldn't go over right away. But when the time was right, and Warner Brothers very graciously allowed me to go over to the network, Leslie brought me over to be the head of drama for CBS Productions.
So what was the state of CBS at the time Les took over?
We were in fourth place, and I really didn't know the network. Again, I knew the network business from the studio side, so really learning kind of what the network business was all about. I had an opportunity to sort of very quickly acclimate myself and learn about what the business was like from a network side. So we were in trouble. I mean, they were, as I said, they were in fourth place. They didn't quite know what their brand was. There were a lot of series that had been on the air for a while. You had Walker, Texas Ranger. You had Touched by an Angel. We had Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. And these shows were skewing a little older. And in an attempt for the previous regime to get the network younger, they had, before Leslie got over there, they had scheduled a number of shows that just made this sort of I don't want to say a shot in the dark, but they made a very bold move to try and get the network younger, but it didn't work. You had to gradually sort of introduce shows that had a younger appeal. So when I got over there, I said, what do I want to watch? You know, what do my peers want to watch? And immediately started taking a high volume of pitches, and the network executive at the time, because I was at the studio affiliated with the network, the in-house production company. So I worked very closely with Anita Addison, who was buying for the network at the time, to find out the kinds of things she was looking for, the kinds of product and writers she wanted to work with. But I also had my own taste.
Right. We're going to stop there. Sorry
Okay.
to interrupt you. And